If everyone can take a seat, that would be great. Okay, so welcome to the 45th Annual International John Gibbs Society Conference. My name is Aaron Cheek. I'm the current president of the Gibbs Society. I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. It's great to see everyone here. People are asking me why I've got a banana in my pocket. And I'm like, I'm just happy to see everyone. But I want to thank CIIS in particular. I want to thank Matthew Seagal, Jeremy Johnson, Heather Fester, also Jennifer Zard for helping me really bring this conference together in many sort of invaluable ways. Yeah. So, there's been, in the last week we've had 3 people withdraw from the conference at last minute, so there's been a few restructurings. And most of the conference program is more or less up to date, except for today we have a slight schedule change, which I've noted on the board. Because Peter Weston could not make it because he was sick, and he sent his regrets. So in place of Peter Weston's talk, which would have been at 1:30, we're having Dave Zuckerman's talk, We Are Eternally Chinese, that is moving up to 1:30. And Linda Bach's talk, which would have been at 3:30 is now, which would have been at 4:15 is now at 3:30. So those are just 2 changes to note today. And they're, as I said, they're on the board, but they're not on the program. So Peter Weston, Zayan Cabot, and Eric Weiss all send their regrets for not being able to make it due to unforeseen circumstances. And while we're on the topic of regrets, I guess, I want to just state briefly my condolences to Peter Pogany, who was a long-standing Gibbsarian, who died in the last, within the last year? He was a... It was before the, yeah, because I was... Yeah, we didn't find out until after the last conference, and he was in March, and I was surprised. I was like, why isn't he here last year? And then we found out after the fact. So I just want to acknowledge his enduring presence at these kinds of conferences. I do have one of his last papers that he sent me, which he presented at the 2013 conference in Los Angeles, which I'm hoping to put up on the website and at least do something. I think we've got that talk recorded too, so I just want to get at least something of Peter up in the near future that, just for his memory. Just a couple of more housekeeping things before we kick off with our first talk. We have a conference dinner tomorrow night. Again, just due to unforeseen changes, it's not the place listed in the conference program. We're going to a place, basically we're going, Matthew, do you remember the name of the place?
Cadillac Grill.
Cadillac Grill, okay. We'll have all the details for you. Yeah, the menu. We'll have the details for you. Basically, we're just going to ask you, bring cash if you're coming to the conference dinner. There's going to be one bill for the whole group, so just make sure you've got the cash to cover it. And that's basically all the housekeeping stuff I needed to say. So we'll move on with our first talk of the day. And first up, we have John Dotson, who's one of our long-standing Gibbsarians. His talk is Das integrale Bewusstsein, and don't worry, the talk is not in German. Chicago, 1969. And put your hands together for John Dotson.
Yes, Peter is greatly missed, Peter Brianna. But I feel that Peter's here anyway, He wouldn't miss a Gibbs. First, also let me offer this invocation for our gathering here to honor the first people who lived from Big Sur to San Francisco Bay, whose descendants are called Ohlone. with the awareness spoken by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Under the crust of that portion of Earth called the United States of America, from California to the Gulf Stream waters, are interred the bones, villages, fields, and sacred objects of American Indians. Here we are. Ted Williams, a Tuscarora man, offers us this big medicine from the Six Nations. Gratitude is the beginning of knowledge and understanding. Aho. And I offer you now these circumambulations, these awarings of the interweaving destinies of all anima, vegeta, and minera. Gebser says that the poet's concern is the history of the dateless. The history of the dateless. For this task, like many of you, I have a standing reserve of books, CDs, DVDs, photographs. I have some vinyl and even 7-inch reel-to-reel. The archives. Gebser. Every manifestation of our lives inevitably contains the sum of what is past as well as what is to come. Thus it is a matter of discerning in the manifestations of our age in what respects they differ from those of earlier epochs. I have called such new or novel manifestations aperspectival manifestations. Aperspectival? Aperspectival? When he wrote that in 1953, I was 3 years old. Some mornings, I get up to consult EPO like the I Ching. It always works. Here is a good one. The very fact that we can discover a point of departure which might be adequate, a point of departure which might be adequate, is beneficial even if it should prove difficult to make it effective at all times, for the assurance spoken of is effective only when it works of itself. Take this photograph as a punctum, a point of departure. This image is from 1950, and I remember how this light fell through the picture window in East Tennessee. I have forever felt an immediate magic in Venetian blind-formed bands of light. I feel diaphaneity, primordial trust. About 2 years old now, at this point of departure, Mother and I are a team. It will be decades before I am aware of the engulfment, the enmeshment, and the necessary psychodiagnosis. In my sandbox, I worked efficient magic, the participation mystique. I loved the intimacies of the textures, specific gravities and scents of sandy sculptural forms. This child is present here today. Here you see me sitting on the knee of a cousin of mine. Daddy is standing at the far right. This is the young men's Bible study class that he taught in 1956. Join me now in the interior of Oak Grove Baptist Church as it existed in 1956. Here it was in the Southern Baptist tradition that I learned how to open a Bible and turn to any book in it. I still can. It feels like I heard 10,000 sermons in this place, or more. The look and feel of this old hymnal is visceral for me. Most every day of my life, some hymn or another runs through my brain. I can also take you to that holler and speak truth to proud ignorance, abusive ignorance, and violent ignorance. My sisters and I are posed here at the family piano. very talented musically, all three of them. Being the baby and the boy, they are 6, 8, and 14 years older, shaped my perceptions of females and femininity. It never occurred to me to think of any female as less than equal. Here I am sledding with my best friend Keith. Keith and I were as close as twin brothers, from birth, in so many ways, inseparable. This is my 1967 yearbook picture, age 16, at the apex of my hometown success. The following spring, I had a severe illness, encephalitis, and was hospitalized in critical condition. I craved the spinal taps. The very high fever dissolved night and day, and I experienced depersonalization, derealization, and ultimately a near-death experience. That changed everything. Keith had a psychological collapse the year before that illness. The eventual diagnosis was failure to develop a functional ego. He could not take the demands of society and never returned to school. Through many years, I came to accept that there was nothing more I could do with him, or for him, or about him. Keith died, long-term involuntary suicide, I have called it, when we turned 30. Thus, I have presentiated for you some of the factors of my personal and social life, a few points of departure. In June 1967, I took my first flight on a jet airplane to Chicago to participate in the High School Institute in Communications at Northwestern University. With that distanciation from my origins, I came upon my soul here on the rocks and the lakeshore and in the waters of Lake Michigan. I felt the transfusion of big city energies. Chicago was pure magic to me, and its myths, the incomprehensibilities, and even the terrors. Here I am at WNUR, the student radio station. The Beatles had released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But equally important for me was the release of this LP, an LP by Marshall McLuhan. That's how I met McLuhan. The medium is the massage. A grad student handed me this unplayed record and suggested it for my discussion program. I played both sides and I rocked. My sensorium was deeply massaged. The world's first live global television link was made possible by communication satellites that June. The program, Our World, included appearances by Pablo Picasso and Prophet McLuhan in Toronto. The event drew the largest television audience to that date, estimated at 400 to 700 million people, and the program closed with the Beatles' All You Need Is Love. I was with it. And with my flight back to Tennessee, I became seriously depressed. I had been elected president of the student body, but my heart was no longer in it. I lost myself in Sgt. Pepper. With the Tet Offensive by communist forces in January 1968, the end of the Vietnam War was not in sight. Anti-war protests erupted all over the US and in Europe. Youth movements with various causes were arising in Europe, Japan. Protests led to the Prague Spring. The icon of Che Guevara was inspiring to some. Che had been killed at age 39 in the fall of 1967. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. At the radio station where I worked, I watched the reports ticking in on the Associated Press teletype machine as waves of rioting swept across more than 100 US cities. Mayor Daley issued shoot-to-kill orders to the Chicago PD. In France, May '68 began with student occupations of universities and factories and then escalated to strikes by 11 million workers lasting 2 weeks and shutting down the French economy completely. Robert Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th after celebrating his presidential primary victories in California and elsewhere. My high school graduation was the following weekend and the election year rolled on. To coincide with the Democratic Convention in Chicago, anti-war protesters, loosely organized, with a festival of life, converged on Grant Park. You can see this film, American Revolution 2, for some stark black and white cinema verite footage. The burning of draft cards morphed into the Battle of Michigan Avenue. A commission later described the violence as a police riot. My friend Richard Damien, born in Chicago and at the time a child professional taking singing lessons in the Loop, remembers emerging from the subway to take in the scene. I felt like I was a part of what was happening, Richard says. For a few minutes, I was shocked to find myself walking beside Jerry Rubin. I noticed he was being followed. When I asked him about it, he told me he was used to being followed by the FBI. The events of that summer had cooled when my circle of soon-to-become lifelong friends converged here at Elder Hall, the dorm beneath the elms and the linden trees. I think it was the second weekend after our arrival that a group of us freshmen took the L to the Loop for our first viewing in Cinerama of 2001: A Space Odyssey. I was astonished. The cinesthetic impulse of Stanley Kubrick's film has been with me ever since. Also that October in Mexico City, 10 days before the opening of the 1968 Summer Olympics, thousands of demonstrators faced troops in Tlatelolco Plaza. Troops opened fire, the shooting lasted 2 hours, and the number of civilian casualties has never been established. With the election on November 5th having campaigned with a secret plan to end the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon defeated Hubert Humphrey. That December, the Apollo 8 astronauts left Earth orbit, becoming the first human beings to observe the whole Earth, the first to see the dark side of the moon and Earthrise, the first to see the whole Earth. On Christmas Day, their reading from the book of Genesis became the most watched broadcast in the history of television. Returning to Chicago after Christmas break in Tennessee, as destiny would have it, and of my own free will and accord, on January 2nd, 1969, I chose to ingest 1 hit of D-lysergic acid diethylamide 25, as had been hand-delivered by my dorm mate from Los Angeles. There was a supernal light, and there was breakage, slippages. But that night, I became a devoted experimentalist. As winter quarter got underway, and as I struggled to maintain my concentration, Nixon was inaugurated on January 20th. In the spring, flowered children all, my friends and I took the L to a free concert by the Jefferson Airplane in Grant Park, less than a year after the Democratic Convention. The concert was our own mini summer of love and congealed our psychosexual awakenings. Shakti, the body electric. I remember a poster in day-glow oranges and yellows, a couple embraced face-to-face in a Kama Sutra position inside a circle of words, "Thank God, the pill." This note, it was a 1965 Supreme Court ruling that guaranteed married couples the right to use birth control. Another court ruling in 1972 guaranteed rights to birth control irrespective of marital status. Imagine. At this time, I had not traveled to California. News coverage was very different in those days. No internet, no instantaneous speed of light worldwide news coverage. We did not watch television, my group, nobody had one. But as my friends and I were blissed out in Grant Park, People's Park was happening over here in Berkeley. As my friend Sandra Sawyer, raise your hand, Sandra, recounts. On May 15, 1969, Bloody Thursday, I was attending San Francisco State. We were striking for the establishment of a Black Studies curriculum. I came home to the roar of tanks rumbling down my street in Berkeley. This was the war at home, under Ronald Reagan's directions. A bystander had been killed, hundreds wounded, bare-breasted young women with long hair slipped long-stemmed flowers down the rifle barrels of National Guardsmen who just stood there, unmoving, eyes glazed over, a long line of them. That June, U.S. troop strength in Vietnam stood at 539,000. 539,000. The Apollo 11 lunar module landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969, my 19th birthday. The next day, Neil Armstrong took his one small step. Woodstock happened in August. In October, the internet was born as ARPANET, the Department of Defense project linking 4 host computers on campuses here in California and in Utah. In November, DC transit buses were circled around the White House when tens of thousands of protesters converged on Washington. President Nixon stayed inside watching a football game on television. Soon afterward, news of the My Lai massacre hit the headlines. On December 1st, to establish a more socially equitable order of call for military service, the Selective Service System conducted lotteries for males born between 1944 and 1950 to 1950. Most of us males had 2S deferments, and the lottery ended those. There was growing resentment about the drafting of 18-year-olds who did not have the right to vote on the policies and politicians that were carrying them off to war. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution, proposed in 1971, was quickly ratified, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. In the early morning of December 4th, the chairman of the Illinois Black Panthers, Fred Hampton, was gunned down by police very early in the morning at his flat in a rundown Chicago neighborhood. A couple of weeks ago, I viewed this documentary. It was made on behalf of the Black Panthers and was in production when the killing occurred. As I watched, I was surprised that the film includes a report by my friend John Hogan, who was a WGN street reporter at that time. In this footage, John was covering the investigative hearings that followed the raid. In the last few days, I've had a lot of talks with John about that period, getting his take on the unrest in the city in 1969, including a concreteness about the establishment, those who were in and those who were out. The murder of Fred Hampton brings Daly's city starkly close. And it was strange to me watching this documentary that among the intense black and white images in this film, my eyes were arrested by a heap of vinyl LPs scattered across the floorboards that are saturated with Fred Hampton's blood. I keep wondering what music the residents of that flat were listening to. I know quite well what we were listening to on the North Shore, and I wonder how much of it was the same. In this photo, my friend Jack Stone is the long-haired, long-bearded artist guy at lower right. As Jack describes it, this photo was shot in a studio in an alleyway near Russian Division. The photo ran in Life and Time magazines. The backdrop was assassination, cities burning, shit, and fan time. Things were rather edgy. All the folks were real, no actors. This was a real tailor, for example. There is a cop in the shop, standing next to the guy holding the kid in the back. Don't know how many of these people actually bought the idea of mending the country. In Easter of 1970, I stayed at school. I found it was fitting on that holy Saturday night to ingest an entheogen. Somehow, as the night wore on, I found myself in front of the television in a friend's apartment. WGN was broadcasting the movie King of Kings. I had tuned in at the Sermon on the Mount. Jeffrey Hunter was starring in the lead role, for which the film had been criticized. I was a teenage Jesus. My viewing turned in a kaleidoscope of multi-textualities. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst, for they shall be satisfied, was followed by an Alka-Seltzer commercial. The concept, after blessed are the peacemakers, came a public service announcement. The concept centered on a close-up of an egg painted as a mini globe held firmly in the hand of a white male. The voiceover was Bob Hope, and the script concerned the threat of nuclear war. At the climax, the hand drops the egg, cut to extreme close-up of impact, egg broken, splattering. Hope spoke of the moral of the spot, that without NATO, the Humpty Dumpty Earth might just fall off the wall. It was a 30-second strange Lovian fairy tale. And now back to Jeffrey Hunter as Jesus Christ, and Happy Easter from all of us at WGN. Well, I knew there was work I had to do. I intuited something about demythologizing, deconstructing the spiritual foundation of my life. I knew I needed to get deeper than the rational. I needed to get deeper than the mythic, into the magical, and deeper still to prehend the psychic energies of the archaic. But I did not have this new language yet. McLuhan was an ally, and now I will apply the term cinemasthetics. In April, after Nixon and Kissinger had dined with Nixon's friend Bibi Rebozo at his home in Florida, often a scene of heavy drinking, the trio screened one of Nixon's favorite films, Patton. Afterwards, as Kissinger reports, Nixon decided we would go for broke. On April 30th, the president appeared in prime time. It is not our power, but our will and character that is being tested tonight. The time has come for action. He announced the launch of U.S. strikes into Cambodia to capture the headquarters of the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. 4 days later, May 4th, at a loosely organized protest on the Kent State campus, members of the Ohio National Guard fired 67 rounds, killing 4 unarmed students and seriously wounding others. Some of the victims were simply walking to class and were uninvolved in the demonstration. Northwestern was among hundreds of universities, colleges, and high schools that was shut down in a nationwide student strike involving 4 million students, my friends and I among them. Society was adrift, as my friend Don Engert recently said in those days. By the way, regarding the Cambodian invasion, it turned out that a single headquarters for control of People's Army operations probably did not exist, or at least was never found. This is the university library at Northwestern, where I attempted to keep some focus on my studies. On one bright morning, as I gazed across Lake Michigan, a flash of insight led to the forming of these words. Generations now living are witnessing changes of a scale without precedent in human experience. Generations now living are witnessing changes of a scale without precedent in human experience. Pictured here is Susan and me, along with Fred the alley cat. Susan and I were soon married and eventually reproduced 3 times. Those children are now adults. Here is my lifelong friend, Mary Ann, shortly after I met her. This is called temporis. And here is her husband, Larry. These pictures are framed and on their wall in Seattle. While I was researching this presentation, Larry sent me a scan of a yellowed article from the Chicago Daily News, October 1969, with a picture of students from Northwestern law and medical schools on Peace March through Luke, and he is among them. As Larry was completing med school and Mary Ann was doing her master's in communications at University of Wisconsin-Madison, I signed up for every class I could that was taught by Professor James M. Eady, and editor of Northwestern University's Studies in Phenomenology. You'll see it in the front of all those books. I took on Husserl, Merleau-Ponty. I built up eclectic bibliographies with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Alan Watts. Even Radhakrishnan and Aurobindo. Alan Watts. He taught here in an earlier incarnation. In some ways, speaking here at CIIS brings me to a full circle of life with Watts. Eastern thought was not much recognized as real philosophy at Northwestern in those days, although it was beginning to change. I had discovered Watts and read a number of his books, and on a bright spring day at a wonderful bookstore in Evanston, the spine of a new arrival caught my eye. Eastern Wisdom and Western Thought, a comparative study in the modern philosophy of religion by P.J. Sahir. Opening this book, I saw the name Jean Gebser for the first time. In his foreword, Gebser's foreword, I read, "Today a new consciousness is rising, in the dawn of which mankind is now living." I was a devotee of dawn. Those words were music to my ears, and my ears were full of music. I bought the book. There's the table of contents. This is what Sahir says. Today, integrale Bewusstsein.
Integrale Bewusstsein. Integrale Bewusstsein.
I just love the look of it. Is, quote, is the most hotly discussed topic in continental circles. The grand doyen of the integral movement is the Swiss poet-philosopher Jean Gebser, an ardent admirer of Aurobindo. According to Gebser's theory, man must wander through different dimensions of consciousness, whereas the phase of the magic consciousness was irrational, that of the myth-derived was non-rational, and the mental period was rational. So is the new phase into which we are now supposed to have evolved. Supra-rational, this phase is called integrale Einsicht. These were portals I could walk through. Sahir. According to Gebser's theory, all things are transparent the moment we perceive them in their essential wholeness. This revelation of transparence is called diaphanerum. Sierra, which means here the perception of the presence of anything simultaneously in all its aspects, both past and present. Now, soon after this, I met Alan Watts, who had shown up in a lounge at the university library. The night before, I had heard him speak the 7 secret sayings of God, which is one of his comic cosmogonies. With trepidation, I walked up to him and posed my question, which was more or less, how do I explain to others the perception of the presence of anything simultaneously in all its aspects, both past and future? To which he instantaneously retorted, I do not exist. That was it. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Alan Watts. Next question. As I was finishing my read of Sahir, I was participating in a seminar led by William T. Powers, who was introducing his new negative feedback theory of behavior and perception. Pulling together as much as I could of my life and my studies, I wrote a long paper, Orders of Experience, Integral Consciousness and Feedback Theory, Towards the Metaphysics of Love. This was good. It's like early neural networking stuff. I drew all these diagrams by hand. There were no programs available. In the paper, I wrote about a correlation of interacting motions, convergent evolution, population growth, technology and its social impact on education and youth culture, technology and mass communication, altered states of consciousness. It is the thesis here that the very forces which have converged in the development of youth cultures are inherently related to an extreme discontinuity, not merely of social and cultural systems, but also the nature of consciousness itself. And then, I wrote, this is an observation of time and change, the convergence and emergence of a new universal worldview, a synthesis of changes in the human spirit, of dimensions without precedent in human experience. When I finished, I mailed a copy of the paper to Alan Watts. Some weeks later, an envelope arrived from the houseboat in Sausalito, and inside was the title page of the paper with an inscription in small, typed little handwriting, "I am keeping your paper because I find it interesting. Alan Watts." I was over the moon. With the passage of time, on a winter day of senior year, I came upon a headline in the Chicago Daily News, which was laying on the kitchen table in the apartment. "Computer predicts shattering environmental problems." The story concerned the Club of Rome report, The Limits to Growth. I felt a panic attack from which I have never recovered. On the one hand, there, at last, the terrors are in big, bold headlines that anyone can see. On the other hand, oh shit, what are we going to do? There's no question now, the human race has got to snap out of it. We've got to make a mid-course correction. A reviewer in the Chicago Tribune, however, took issue with the Club of Rome computer modeling and interpretations. I had zero sense of the ferocity of forces that would rage against the environmental movement. I expected that everyone would soon be recycling, driving small cars. In my imaginings, the future was unfolding like large format pages of the whole Earth catalog. The future was calling me from Chicago to the blue skies of the West. So a quick cut now from Chicago 1972 to San Francisco 2015. I look around. What changes is a 3-foot rise in sea level going to manifest? We can start there and then add feet. It is the business of the future to be dangerous, according to Alfred North Whitehead. It is high time for serious conversation. Where do we find ourselves placed, each one and all of us, on the electronic chessboard of the geopolitical environment? As if truth is, in truth, a manipulable market commodity. As if we are imprisoned by the invisible masters of time. As if we could not be free. Yet in the great teachings, we are born to be. Say amen. No, next cut. Volume, please.
Number nine.
More volume.
Number nine. Number nine. Number nine. Number nine. Number nine.
Everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be all right. Sahara, 1969. A ruthless nemesis is about to put every religion, philosophy, theory, dogma, and ideology to the test. This is the challenge of our times, and the world has never faced a more serious one on such a scale. Gebser. Whatever evokes anxiety in us does so because it overwhelms. More volume. More volume. What came to me a long time ago as I contemplated this bed on the wide screen, the aging astronaut lifting his hand, pointing to the monolith. Something must die for something to be born. Transmutation. World civilization in dehiscence. In our discontinuities, in the mighty slippages, we are continuing the journeys of the ancestors. And we are ancestors. Crawling around on the floor with our children. I play hide and seek with my grandchildren. In the global cinema statique. Saher in 1969. The power behind evolution which guides the universe will speak to the coming generation in more imperious tones and demonstrate its existence through events far more startling than a soft landing on the moon. A perfect dictionary is not required. Gebser. What is decisive for us is to know in any given instance where and how to act passively or actively. Where and how to make things happen or let things happen to us. Not my will, but thine be done. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Be not afraid. Here is a shamanic mask that my brother artist John Rebstock made for us today, and I have copies for you if you want.
Any questions or comments for John?
Nate? Is that 3:45?
A veritable sermon.
Yes, ma'am.
I so appreciate how you personalize everything you read into your own blood and sweat and experience and reflection. And every year you come with this completely new, innovative method of inner research. And I love that about your contributions. Your innovative research methods and how they continue to evolve. That being said,
Namaste. Yeah. Now the bed.
that said, this past year I've been really immersed in mental illness and really interested in it. And I'm working on 2 pieces right now. One on Alzheimer's and one on the voice of death from somebody contemplating suicide. And when you speak about the experience of your best friend, you said, in your opinion, he died of long-term involuntary suicide. I don't understand, like for me that's an oxymoron, involuntary suicide, but coming from you, I really want to know how you put that together and what that means, because those undercurrents, it's like that's what it's all about, is how these undercurrents are driving us and how we meet those undercurrents. Can you speak to that?
My long journey with Carl Jung began a little bit after this, but anyway, Keith was immediate. That's one thing I want with this presentation is that, you know, you don't have to do scholarship. You want one necessarily. Scholarship is important. But the immediate life experiences, yes, I grew up with Keith, as I said, and I could speak for the rest of the day and get started. But at any rate, no one really noticed. As Keith began to collapse, and when he had his breakdown, from which he never returned, I could still communicate with him, as clear as I'm speaking with you right now. But he was unable to function in society, unable to go back to school. At one point, he asked his mother, who was traveling in Japan, to bring him a harikari sword, which she did. How that can happen, I don't. Can you just go buy a harikari sword? But at any rate, it was brought home and put over the portal of the family room in the house, a harikari sword. But Keith did not choose to die, and yet he was killing himself at the same time. And only by killing himself, and as I did some study, the honorable harikari, the student, in this case Keith, a student to his father as master, the only way the noble student can communicate with the master is not to kill the master who has gone awry, but to kill himself, to communicate to the master. And I believe that's what happened. So it's so vast, we can talk more.
May I add something? In keeping with your I Ching, what is decisive for us is to know in any given instance where and how to act passively or actively, where and how to make things happen or let things happen to us. This is a function of, in Chinese medicine, what we term the liver, which is the rising force of spring, the generative force of all things. And when the rising of that generative force in us is met with humiliation and is met with physical, often physical abuse, this is the thing that then saps and taps and destroys the rising up of that xylem from the earth and leads to involuntary suicide.
In my current work with the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, and I went under the bed in Dylan Thomas's bedroom where Lisa and I were writers in residence some time ago. But in my own writing, I returned to go under Dylan Thomas's bed in Wales. And could never, I've still not come out, it's been a year, but going back to the archaic, in Dotson language, the archaic, where there is no differentiation of creation and destruction.